It is February 1st, and if you are a fan of the Toronto Raptors or one of the handful of teams that have not a lot of success this year, but a lot of expiring contracts, future picks, and a lot of cap flexibility, you might be licking your chops because this is basically Christmas for you. The Toronto Raptors have a lot of decisions to make, and there are plenty of available big contract X stars, X all stars available. But the Toronto Raptors are looking to be connectors, facilitators at the trade deadline. Perhaps they're looking to be the Scotty Barnes of the trade deadline and just a good friend, a good neighbor, right? Someone who can help you out when you need it because you locked yourself into a terrible contract and you don't know how to get rid of it. Well, here comes the Toronto Raptors with their bevy of exceptions and expiring contracts and potentially a couple of seconds to make things work. And the Raptors could be very opportunistic or they could stand pat. History tells us they will not stand pat. So, more than likely, whether it is a minor deal or a major deal, someone is probably about to get shipped out. And I think that leads to a lot of anxiety for NBA players, but it also leads to a lot of confusion for fans, especially as the league has progressively made their CBA a lot harder to understand. And if you're one of those people like me who had a lot of trouble understanding the CBA, understanding what apron restrictions were, understanding, what picks can be moved, what are the implications, what's a second apron, what is it, repeater tax, all of these things. Well, there is a godsend for you, and that godsend is he goes by the name of Blake Murphy. He's been on the show before. Blake is covering the NBA for many years now for the Raptors, and he wrote a beautiful primer. He does it every single year. And Blake's a bit of a cap nerd, no offense. And he certainly breaks it down better than I ever could. So I'm going to use his article as a guidebook on how to guide us through the trade deadline and figure out first and foremost what can the Raptors do and why are the Raptors in such an enviable position going into February 6th at 3 p.m. Now, to those of you who are longtime members of this channel, you know that we do a lot of live streams. And if you've been following us recently, you've been noticing we haven't been doing live streams. And that is largely due to a copyright strike because of the Scotty Barnes interview that we played. I reached out to YouTube, and it seems that our copyright restrictions, which have restricted our lives, are going to be lifted right before the trade deadline. So hopefully, we will be able to go live that day and get you covered all through the trade deadline from afternoon till the post, covering it all, probably 4 or 5 hours. And hopefully we experience no issues doing that. Let's get to this. And first, I mean, before we explore what targets the Raptors will be looking at, let's just look at what the rules are, basically. What are we working with here? Right. So, shout outs to Blake for writing this up. I'm not going to read it all. Of course, you're free to check it out. It's on sportsnet.ca, also in the description, but check it out. It's a really fantastic read for those of you who really want to get into the nitty-gritty. But here is the basics. Let's just, go into the basics of it. And this is where we're at, right? The Raptors have a lot of expiring contracts, and some of those expiring contracts are tied to fan favorite players. Players like Chris Boucher, and to a lesser extent, but certainly not a non-existent extent, Davion Mitchell. And these are two players that I believe a lot of contenders could be looking at to fill out the end of their roster. Chris is an energy big. He is on a $10.8 million expiring. Bruce Brown is also available at $23 million, is a very big expiring contract. The trouble with Bruce, of course, is it's a little bit hard to match that salary. There aren't a lot of $23 million type contracts. But that's where the cap restrictions and the salary restrictions come in. Number one, the $10 million. So this is tool number one, according to Blake, which is the $10 million in space beneath the luxury tax. So it's worth noting that the Raptors, due to the Davion Mitchell trade, are hard capped at the first apron, but they're so significantly below the luxury tax that this doesn't really have a lot of implications. They're not expecting to be a tax team this year, anyways. So they do have this $10 million of space to play with, which means it's pretty much free money. They can obviously use this via their mid-level exception. I don't believe there's an expiration date on that that I'm aware of. So they can definitely do that, but they can also facilitate a trade for a team that maybe is a little bit deep into the luxury tax payments and is feeling the pressure of the restrictions on their roster, and they would just be looking to shed $10 million. So maybe it just means taking a $33 million player on for a $23 million player, getting them under the tax, not pushing yourself past the tax, and then being compensated in return. Of course, it could also mean facilitating being a part of a trade in which two teams who are not ideal bedfellows to make a trade, because again, apron teams, it becomes hard to, you can't aggregate salaries, you can't, you can't take a dollar over. So depending on the team that's involved, the Raptors will be able to sort of pack in whatever flexibility that team requires. So the $10 million dollars in cap space beneath the luxury tax is what the Raptors have to work with. It's worth noting they're not the only team that has this availability. Detroit, Utah, Washington, and San Antonio, they're similarly rebuilding teams that could rent out their tax space, and Oklahoma City and Houston also have this space as well. In theory, according to Blake, this is a quote, the Raptors could go into the tax, but it wouldn't make a ton of sense to. And I completely agree. There's a stipulation, or there's a rule that you pay repeater tax. So the sooner you start the clock on the tax, the Raptors have never really historically shown their willingness to go into the tax and pay that luxury tax bill. And then there's also the incentive for not being a tax team, which is you get a payout at the end of the season from the league, which is $18 million per team. The Raptors would be very foolish to go all in on a 15-win roster and be like, no, 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 we're going to be a tax team so that we can facilitate some sort of win now, last ditch effort move for Brandon Ingram. That would be crazy. Okay. So here's a note on the luxury tax apron for the Raptors, according to Blake. The Raptors salary, a number cited for tax purposes above, does not include $6.1 million is on the books for unlikely incentives. Again, unlikely incentives are just, I mean, RJ Barrett making all-star, Jakob Poeltl, there's, hold on one second here. There's a bonus here. Sorry, Emmanuel quickly. So 500K for each MVP, all NBA, all star. Okay. Not as an injury replacement, making third round, making finals, winning a championship, etc. So these are all like the types of unlikely incentives that are baked into the contract. As you recall, the initial figure on Emmanuel Quickly's contract was 35 million, and that was adjusted to 32.5, largely because the 2.5 are these unlikely incentives, right? So again, the mid-level exception as a trade exception, this was something new introduced into the recent CBA, where teams are now able to push off using their mid-level exception, whereas before it was a use it lose it type of situation. You could not trade a mid-level. Now under the new CBA, you can trade it. This has had disastrous consequences, if you're being honest, because teams are choosing to not use it, hold on to it, and previously almost every team used their mid-level, or they split it between 2 3 players. So this has been really bad for players like Gary Trent Jr., who would have probably commanded something close to a mid-level exception. This will also continue to be a pain in the ass for players like Bruce Brown, who again are ideal fits for that mid-level exception type of money. Kelly Olynyk. The Raptors have a lot of guys who would probably, in theory, command the mid-level. Last year, the Raptors used their mid-level on Dennis Schroeder, if you recall, and then traded him for nothing. And then, the team that got him, and they got 3 second-round picks. Yeah, you live and you learn. Okay, so the mid-level exception as a trade exception is something that the Raptors could do to basically give something for nothing or take back something for nothing. And this would allow them to offer a team the maximum level of flexibility. Okay, so good players on expiring contracts of all size. So the Raptors, as before mentioned, have Bruce Brown, Chris Boucher, Davion Mitchell. That's 23 million, 10.8 million, and 6.5 million. Productive players, debatable, but yes, productive recently. All three have been a huge part of the Raptors winning recently. And they have Kelly Olynyk, who has a roughly 25, $26 million contract over the next 2 years. It's not a whole lot of money. And especially for a team that's really desperate, it could be something which you might get a couple seconds for. I think for the Raptors, it just might be worth keeping Kelly around. I don't think Kelly's going to get moved, but his DMPCD yesterday certainly does put me on red alert. Other assets and exceptions that Blake has talked about includes cash. Teams can send and receive up to $7.2 million in trades this league year. So the Raptors already sent $1 million to acquire over Shumshay. They could do something similar and send out cash, but that seems very unlikely. The draft picks. Worth noting, the Raptors are in an enviable, somewhat not great, but good position with their draft picks going forward. They have their own first this year, next year, and going forward every single year because they surrendered that pick that turned into the eighth overall pick this past year, top six protected, to the San Antonio Spurs, who then later shuttled it off to the Minnesota Timberwolves when their target, Stephon Castle, was not on the board. So that ends up being a situation where, okay, the Raptors have a surplus of picks. Is this something that they want to build on, or is this something they want to capitalize on now? And again, the Indiana Pacers are doing well. The Raptors are not doing well. So if there is a pick that you would look to trade in this situation, it probably is one of your own. If you're expecting that the league is expecting you to be bad, if the Raptors were to, for instance, trade their 2026 top five protected, something like that. Well, it's a very risky move, as we found out with the Jakob Poeltl trade, and it can backfire tremendously, especially for a team that could go in a multitude of directions. But if you're the Raptors, you're probably not going to get as much for that pick next year if you end up being good. So this might be one of those situations of internal calculus where you want to take a risk, take a gamble, bet on yourself, if you will, borrow a little philosophy from Fred VanVleet. I don't know. Okay, so the Raptors could do that, and they also hold the second round pick from the Portland Trailblazers this year. They hold this, and they hold most of their seconds going forward as well. So this is really interesting. And again, that aforementioned pick from Indiana, you don't know what could happen to Indiana next year. One injury to one of their star players, a little bit of disgruntled. That is a top four protected pick. I am not betting on that team to be great next year. It's difficult to project right now, a year out, what that roster is going to look like. They have a lot of young players, Andrew Nemhard, right? But there's chatter that Miles Turner may not be back. I think he's been a huge part of what they've done well this year. There's also the Obi Toppin thing. Is this a fluke year? Is this what he's going to be next year? There's a lot of, like, I don't want to say unsustainable success there, but Tyrese Halliburton, a lot of injury history. Pascal Siakam, there's injury history. There's a possible regression there coming, with a quick switch athlete that I projected several years ago. So again, I don't think the Indiana Pacers are like, okay, well, you hold the OKC Thunder's pick. It's never going to be good. Like, there's a chance that could be a lottery pick for sure. I mean, the East could get dramatically better. The Indiana Pacers could suffer one injury, and then boom, you're holding a lottery pick in the 2026 draft, which is loaded. I wouldn't trade that pick because I don't think right now it's worth a lot. If the Indiana Pacers were really bad right now, maybe that pick would be worth a lot. So it's worth noting that I don't think that the Indiana pick is going anywhere. And as I say this, I shudder to think that that pick is going to get traded, but let us hope not. Okay. So in terms of the trade rules, all right, here are the teams that are above the second apron. That's Boston, Milwaukee, Minnesota, and Phoenix. Okay. So 100% of the outgoing salary and no aggregating players, which means that you match dollar for dollar. You cannot take $1 more than what you're putting out in a trade, which means that if you're trading a Bradley Beal, if you're Phoenix, you cannot take back anything more than what Bradley Beal makes. Now, it's hard to find a player in the league that makes more than Bradley Beal that's available. So that's not really a huge issue for Phoenix. But if they wanted to trade one of their smaller contracts, like a Grayson Allen or something like that, it's really difficult because the only way to do it is to take back less salary, right? And that becomes problematic because you have a certain number of teams that actually are right up against the luxury tax. They don't want to take another dollar back. So you almost have to match identical contracts, which means you'd have to find a $23 million player and be like, okay, we want to trade him for another $23 million player. And if you're a team like Boston, Milwaukee, Minnesota, and Phoenix, these are the only types of deals you can actually make. The one for ones with the exact matching salary. You hear me shaking my head? That means that it just cannot be done. It's very difficult to make those trades. And that's where the third team comes in. That is where the third team comes in to facilitate the salaries that can make everything match up. They can take on anything else. Again, really difficult to make a deal work between two second apron teams, but maybe you can make it work between a first apron team and a second apron team. And it's ironic that these are the teams that are usually the most desperate to make trades. Milwaukee, Minnesota, and Phoenix are all desperately looking to trade players. Minnesota with potentially Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo. Phoenix looking to trade Bradley Beal. Milwaukee looking to trade Chris Middleton. Well, it's going to be difficult. If you're above the first apron, like Denver, the Lakers, Miami, New York, or Philly, right? Provided you are not hard capped at that figure, you have 110% of your outgoing salary. Okay. Now, If you're close to the apron, right, which like Golden State and Dallas, above rules if it pushes them above the apron, below rules if not. So below above the cap, below the apron, which is Atlanta, Brooklyn, Charlotte, Chicago, Cleveland, Houston, Indiana, the Clippers, the Grizzlies, the Pelicans, the OKC Thunder, Orlando, Portland, Sacramento, San Antonio. So if your outgoing salary is less than 2.75 million, you can take back 200% plus 250K. If your outgoing salary is 7.5 to 29 million, then you can take the outgoing plus 7.5 million. And if your outgoing salary is greater than 29 million, then you can take back 125%. Again, an improvement plus the 250K, which is an improvement over the first apron teams who can only take 110%, and the second apron teams who, as aforementioned, can only take 100%. So in terms of teams that actually have cap space, that's the Detroit Pistons. That's it. Those are the teams that actually have cap space. So in terms of like what the Raptors can do, certainly they can do a lot. Okay. And it's specifically going to come down to these five players. Now, I'm not saying these are the only five players that can be moved. There's certainly talk around the league of Ochai Agbagi being a very valuable role player that some teams covet right now. Maybe the Raptors are looking down the road at his extension and saying, maybe it's going to be a little rich for our blood. We understand who he is. We understand his restrictions and his limitations after a year of being with him. We like him, but with Grady, with RJ, with Jacoby, we don't see a role for him on this roster next year, especially if we end up drafting a wing. So instead of just shafting him, let's put him in a position where he's a viable role player on a winning team or something like that. I don't know. You could add Ochai Baji to this. I think it's highly unlikely that Ochai moves. I do think it's likely that Chris Boucher is moved, and that is a bummer, right? As a fan, obviously, Chris Boucher, Bruce Brown, very different situations. It's hard to not root for Chris, right? And he obviously wants to be here. He's responded to several of our posts, basically like, y'all just want to trade me, y'all want to get me out of here so bad, etc. He's very close with Scotty Barnes. This is not going to be some easy thing to forget, right? There's certain players that just kind of stick with the fans. We had guys like Charles Oakley. I'm not trying to say that Chris Boucher is Charles Oakley or Alvin Williams, or, he's just a scrappy guy that a lot of people really like around Toronto. A lot of people like in the media. And it would be really kind of sad to trade him in the midst of a career year. However, if you're the Raptors, you're also looking at all of these expiring contracts and you're like, what is going to be the cost to bring these guys back next year? And if they are unrestricted free agents, as most of these guys are, even if you have their bird rights, what is a dollar figure that you're going to be able to keep them at when another team comes out with 6, 7 million, 8 million, 10 million, etc. The less likely guys who could be moved, Davion Mitchell, Kelly Olynyk, and Jakob Poeltl. I think Davion is a perfect, shift him off to a third team, get another second. You've already gotten 2 seconds to take on the contracts of Davion Mitchell and Sasha Vazenko. So then to convert one into an absolute buyout in which you pay zero, and then to convert the next asset that you took on as a quote unquote negative asset, which was Davion Mitchell, and then convert him into a second round pick is valuable. It's also worth noting that Davion has been a leader for the Raptors. He has been a demon defensively in terms of his point of attack stuff. It's also worth noting he's really not showing a hell of a lot offensively, even though he is starting to hit his shots. I think there is a future for Davion in Toronto. It's hard to see that future coinciding with Jamal Shed. So when Darko says Jamal is the future, I think the writing is on the wall for Davion. I don't want to be carrying two of these guys into next year. And I hate to say it, right? These are the decisions you got to make as a front office. I love Jeff Doughton, right? I love Jeff Doughton. I loved Sam Decker. I liked Joe Wieskamp. There's a lot of guys, but it's like at some point, how many of these guys can you keep on your roster, right? You got to have productive role players. You got to have specialists. Davion is a specialist. He's a point of attack defensive specialist. But when your team gets better, if he can't do more than that one thing, then he becomes basically a special teams guy. He becomes like the bigs that you used to stack on your bench when Shaquille O'Neal was running the league, like that 7-footer who would just come in and play 5 minutes and pick up 6 fouls. That guy. Well, Davion Mitchell is basically like the guy that you keep at the end of your bench as a 13th guy. And, everybody loves him. He competes hard in practice. He pushes everybody. He's great, and he's talkative. He's constantly keeping that energy up in your practices. Is a very, very valuable thing. in an NBA season to have that guy who's just super hardworking. I mean, I've attended two practices for the Raptors and several games this year. I can tell you one thing: there's nobody who starts shoot around before Davion. Nobody. There's nobody who comes out to the court first before Davion. He's the first guy out. You want your point guards to be leaders. Problem is, you also want your point guards to be creators. You want your point guards to be able to throw good entry passes. You want your point guards to be dynamic, shifty, and be able to finish at the rim. These are not descriptors of Davion Mitchell. So I think that, if you could look at Davion Mitchell as a nice to have, but maybe you got to make a choice between him and Jamal, the choice has been made, and it's a very obvious choice. So you're not bringing him back. If you're not bringing him back, why lose him for nothing? When there is a team out there like the Lakers or potentially someone like that who could easily use him over someone like a Gabe Vincent. Now, a Davion for Gabe Vincent swap, does that get you a first round pick for a second round pick? That type of thing? I don't know about that. Davion may not have that kind of value, but maybe Davion is the type of player that you add to a Bruce Brown or add to a Kelly Olynyk. I could certainly see a world in which Davion is traded. This is a quick shout out to our sponsor, the Pendance Film Festival. The Pendance Film Festival has announced its 2025 festival selections. There are plenty of just fantastic films coming your way, tons of directors attending. And yes, on Sunday, we have a double sports doc, and it is called The Last Game by John Alpert, and it's making its world premiere. Explores how climate change is threatening the future of hockey, spanning 5 continents and bringing global perspectives to the fore. It's paired with Basketball State, The Land of 10,000 Hoops, a captivating documentary by Gabe that celebrates the rise of basketball in Minnesota by talking to and listening to NBA players and prominent WNBA players. Lots of clips, very interesting documentaries. Those are on Sunday. There's plenty of stuff for everybody. There's a horror. If you're a horror junkie, we got you covered on Sunday night. We got you covered on Saturday night. So it's a really solid selection of films. If you like to laugh, we got you covered on Friday night and Saturday evening. So there's a lot for everybody at this one. It's our biggest festival ever. 71 films selected. I hope you'll consider visiting us for the Pendance Film Festival. It is a really great celebration of artists. It is a creative endeavor, certainly, but it's also a creatively inspiring experience. I think that a lot of people who come to Pendance say afterwards they feel very inspired, very light, and quite frankly, very touched, moved, and are thinking about these films for a long time. That's our goal as programmers when we program these films. And I curate Pendance with the same love, attention, thought to detail that I do Pensare Basketball. It's my baby. Been running Pendance since 2017. Founded it December 15th, my mom's death anniversary. So hopefully you come check out Pendance. Last year there was a lot of Pensare Basketball people at Pendance, and most of you said that you had a really fantastic time. So I look forward to hopefully getting you guys out again. All right. The Raptors are probably not going to stand pat. They've been active at every single deadline. Now, for better or for worse, because I think some of their biggest blunders as a front office have come at the trade deadline. Ironically, you look at the Gary Trent trade for Norman Powell. That was at the deadline. That was a mistake. In hindsight, and at the time, it was a mistake straight up. The Thaddeus Young trade, probably a mistake. If you're being honest with yourself, the Jakob Poeltl trade was probably a mistake as well. So the Raptors have fumbled quite a few times at the trade deadline. Last year, the deal that ended up happening was Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbagi. I was not mad at it at the time, and I'm not mad at it now. I think it was a fantastic trade, and it's worked out largely because Ochai has become so much better in Darko's system. He's a young player who really fits in and does a lot of stuff well that maybe you don't have on your roster right now, like the rim protection from the guard position, rebounding, point of attack defense, and frankly, the corner shooting has been elite. So overall, maybe the Raptors will be wise to just avoid the trade deadline altogether, but I don't think they will. I think there's a long-term consequence to taking on, crippling salaries. I don't think the Raptors are in any position to do that right now, and nor should they. They really shouldn't be taking on anything, past next year, because that then will make it harder for you to build something competent around Scotty Barnes. It's also worth noting the Raptors have never been a free agent destination. And while I do expect Scotty to be the type of superstar that players want to play with, I don't ever think they're going to want to play with him over wanting to play in Los Angeles or Miami. So when those teams have cap space, you're always going to be the third, fourth, or sometimes fifth dog to the bowl. That does make getting those high end free agents a little bit more difficult, but we shall see what becomes available I think there's also, the benefit of parking your cap space when you're not a really good team, operating below luxury tax when you're not a good team. These are just smart, prudent business decisions by the Raptors, not, taking on any long-term salary allows you to be flexible even next year. But if you do take on like a 2-year deal, let's just say you take on like a contract like Kelly Olynyk, well, then you can just trade him this summer as an expiring and continue to do this song and dance in perpetuity. Like you can just keep doing it and keep extracting first round picks and second round picks. If you recall how the Oklahoma City Thunder got their haul of draft picks, at least part of it, not all of it, but part of it was by parking their cap space when Shea was still developing and using that time to really develop him, develop a young core, pick high in the draft, pick well, develop, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe the Raptors would be wise to follow that example, stockpile some draft picks. I'll tell you right now, the one thing that's going to really disappoint me on trade deadline, day is if okay, let me give you a list of few things that would be very disappointing and a few things that would not be disappointing. So I would be disappointed to see Emmanuel quickly go. I don't think he's necessarily shown the best of himself, and it'll be interesting to see if he were to get traded, how much better he'll look at his next stop. I think this dude's a killer. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure at the time if he was worth 32.5 million, but I do think he's a serviceable starter in the NBA for somebody. Certainly. In a league where Contavious Caldwell Pope is making that type of money, Bruce Brown's making this type of money, I think Emmanuel quickly is worth $32 million. But Emmanuel quickly being traded would be a little bit of a disappointment. I do think I'd be a little bit disappointed if someone like Grady or Jacoby got traded, just because I do have some faith in these guys going forward. I will riot. It's very rare for for two-way guys to get traded, but I would riot absolutely if Ulrich got traded. I think that would just be like a no-fly zone for me. Ulrich and Scotty, I can't imagine trading either of those guys. I don't think either of those guys are going anywhere though. I would be a little bit disappointed to see someone like Jameson Battle get moved, especially, if the Raptors can procure some sort of or secure a second round pick or something like that for him. Again, it's very rare for two-way guys to be moved. I would be disappointed to see, to some extent, to see Kelly Olynyk go, right? I do think you just have institutional knowledge that gets passed down from the vets and the OGs to the young guys. And I just think Kelly's such a fantastic veteran. Like he's a really good guy from everything I've heard. And there's a lot of bigs on this team who could really learn a lot from him. He's very smart. So if you're gonna lose Jakob, losing Kelly too would be a bit of a blow. I will be extremely disappointed if Bruce Brown does not get traded. I do not think that he is going to come back or resign in Toronto, and I think the Raptors holding on to him for this long is just going to be it's going to burn them. Either you're going to overpay him to stay, or you're going to lose him for nothing. And I just don't want to see him on this team after the trade deadline. It's nothing personal against Bruce, fantastic player, really good role player, probably help, a lot of teams. But right now, I don't need him to help with the winning. I need him to help with the draft pick. I gotta say, I'll be very conflicted when Chris Boucher gets moved, knowing the Raptors are not going to throw him to Charlotte or something, like Washington. They're going to actually put him in a good position to succeed. And I do think that if I'm a contender, I'm looking at Chris Boucher right now. It would suck, because he's been here. He's the last vestige of the championship team, and will he or won't he like move on, and would he be upset about it, etc. But for Chris, he just wants to win, man. Everybody just wants to win, and so if you can put him in a position like Dallas, you can put him in a position like OKC or something like that, where he can actually win a little bit more. I don't think he'd be too salty about it at all. These are NBA players, after all. They understand the business. What else would be disappointing? I won't be disappointed if Davion Mitchell gets traded. I think it's a bit of a clunky fit with Jamal Shed. I will, however, be very disappointed if it's Jamal Shed that gets traded. Again, unlikely, very unlikely. So, what else would disappoint me? If the Raptors take on a really bloated salary like a Bradley Beal, I mean, there's no chance in hell Bradley Beal ends up on the Raptors, because he would have a no trade clause that would basically, he would just say, I don't want to be here. He's already said multiple times that his family loves Phoenix, that he's not really going to waive that no trade clause for the wrong situation. So I don't see how he ends up in Toronto. But there are certain players who could end up in Toronto. And I'm not really sure how I feel about Brandon Ingram's fit long term, especially if it costs the Raptors RJ Barrett. Now, I have my issues with RJ Barrett. I think he's very limited as an offensive player, which is crazy to say given that I sit here capping for Scotty and talk about Scotty's potential, etc. But I just think the upside on defensively and offensively with RJ Barrett is somewhat limited. And I do think ideally at some point he settles into more of a six-man role on a good team somewhere. But you look at teams like the Detroit Pistons, you look at teams like that, and you're like, would they do that? Would they in the search for relevance, would they want to trade for a guy like RJ Barrett to just, inject a little bit more offense? You look at a team like Orlando, do they have enough defense to cover for him? Is that the type of deal where, you take RJ for an ill-fitting, Contavious Caldwell Pope contract, or Jonathan Isaac or something like that, and you just take picks in return, like one pick? I don't know. Like, I'm not really sure what RJ's value is around the league. I'm not sure how much GMs value him, how much that, Gatorade National Player of the Year, number one recruit stuff is still kind of percolating people's minds as a potential outcome. But I think people are convinced that RJ is who he is at this point. I do think it's worth noting that he has just become such a better playmaker this year, and he is trying on defense lately. So maybe RJ isn't a problem in Toronto, and I certainly am not advocating that he's a problem. I just think long term, if you are looking to extend him, does he have, as the team's leading scorer, does he have a realistic expectation of what those extensions or that extension dollar looks like? I think that would be a huge thing to factor out beforehand because, again, once you get there, now you're in a sticky situation again. And, he's a hometown kid. He's from here. He wants to be here. That means a lot to people in this city. It doesn't mean a hell of a lot to me, though. Contracts are contracts. And if you don't fit, you don't fit. If I got to lose every year in the playoffs because you can't guard and you can't fit in with the players on my roster, I don't really care how much you want to be here. So that's just my sort of unemotional, detached take on that. Anyways, let me know what you think the Raptors are going to do at the trade deadline. Hopefully, this video has been somewhat informative in terms of addressing some of the cap minutia and the trade deadline stuff. I will reiterate that hopefully we will have a live stream on the day of of the trade deadline. Hopefully, hopefully. Maybe if we don't, we'll do a Twitter live that day or something. I don't know. Is there another live? An IG live? I don't know. We'll figure it out. Alrighty, guys. I'll talk to y'all later. Have a great one. Make sure to hit like on this video and subscribe. Peace.